Welcome, guys, to the Dawn Patrol Rendezvous. I hope everyone's enjoying the event. I'm Jeremy Bowles. I'm amateur World War I historian. I've worked for various different organizations. I've worked for the Veterans Memorial Museum Foundation in Germantown, Ohio, and worked part-time for the Air Force Museum Foundation. But I've worked on various organizations as a bit of a World War I historian. I've been involved here with the Dawn Patrol event for probably the last decade. I kind of go by a little moniker known as the Dayton Doughboys since I'm from the Dayton region. But today I'm going to kind of talk about, and I'm hoping you guys can go through with the PowerPoint with me. I know it's hard to see. But I want to give a general history view of what World War I was, what were the causes, how the war evolved, and maybe it'll kind of help understand some of the things. So when you guys are out there in the event and you see it, stuff in the living history encampment, it might make more sense, and even the planes and stuff. First thing I want to talk about, though, get this to work. There we go. What were the causes of the Great War? So there were numerous things that led up to the war breaking out. First was European colonialism. All these different European nations and monarchs were competing against each other for different colonies all throughout. The second part was the Industrial Revolution. New technologies, new manufacturing processes really contributed to leading things towards warfare. The second was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. This was a small conflict that happened after the Napoleonic Wars between France and Germany when Germany first became a unified nation. The resulting end of that was France won the war, and the Germans were pretty bitter about it. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. The Germans won the war. The French were pretty bitter. Thank you. I caught myself. After that war ended, there were a lot of these nations that started forming secret alliances with each other. And basically they realized, hey, you know, if I'm going to fight this country here, I might want to have a couple buddies of mine to back me up. Well, that country had the same mentality. So you start getting a lot of secret alliances forming. Then you also have a lot of nationalism, national pride. You had bitter competitiveness between the royal families. At this point in time, every sitting monarch in Europe was related to each other. They were all related to Queen Victoria, the Queen of England. And then finally, the biggest part of it was an arms race. This goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Britain would build a weapon, a ship. Germany would have to build another ship bigger and better. And then Britain would have to build another one, back and forth. So you start having all this arms race. And as you start getting more and more countries developing more and more weapons, they're going to be more and more willing to want to use those weapons. But the war finally kicked off with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and when he was killed by a group from Serbia who wanted to separate from Austro-Hungary Empire and form their own country, it basically triggered a chain reaction all throughout Europe. Serbia was given ultimatums by Austro-Hungary. They pretty much complied with all of them, but just maybe one or two, and that was just enough of a pretext for Austro-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. The problem is, going back to those secret alliances I was referring to, Austro-Hungary knew that Serbia's big brother was Russia. They were afraid that if they went to war with Serbia, they would draw Russia in, and they feared fighting a war against Russia. So Austro-Hungary went to their neighbor, Germany, who had just defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War, and basically said, hey, we're going to go to war with Serbia. Will you support us? And will you kind of intervene in case Russia decides to intervene on behalf of Serbia? Germany said yes. Now, the war breaks out. At first, the Germans contacted the Russians and said, hey, you're going to stay out of this. If you stay out, we're going to stay out. Russia, under the Tsar Nicholas II, basically said yes, but then the Russian military started to mobilize. When they started to mobilize, Germany got a little worried, and then they started mobilizing. And before you know it, Germany declared war on Russia. Going back to the secret alliances, Germany knew that after the Franco-Prussian War, Russia had made an alliance with France. So they were afraid that if they went to war with Russia, they would end up fighting France too, and then be fighting a two-front war. So immediately, Germany declared war on France as well. And Germany had this plan to defeat France rather quickly, since they'd already beat them once at the Franco-Prussian War. This was the German Schlieffen Plan. The plan was for the German army to rapidly move through neutral Belgium and invade through northern France and capture Paris. The problem with this is Belgium, being neutral, was a protectorate nation of the British. So as soon as the German armies crossed into Belgium, this dragged in the British army. Once the British got into the war, the British called upon their dominion, all the Commonwealth, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, all the nations that were colonies of the British Empire started coming in. And before you know it, you have complete and total war. Now, something else that's interesting about this war, it is called World War for a reason. Most people think of the fighting only occurring in Europe on the Western Front. Some people realize that the fighting also happened on the Eastern Front against the Russians and the Germans. There was fighting along the Italian Alps, but this did happen worldwide. There was fighting in Africa. There was fighting in the Middle East. There was fighting in Asia. There was fighting in the Pacific Islands. So this was a true world war. Now, going back to Germany invading Belgium and the Schlieffen Plan, the British sent over a small contingent of force. They call it the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. And along with the French, they stopped the Germans at the frontiers and the border area between France and Belgium. Now, the German army did push further back, and at Mons, the British faced the first major battle. After the Mons, the Germans continued to push on towards Paris and eventually reached the banks of the Marne River outside of Paris. This is where you had the first Battle of the Marne, the famous one in which the French troops were being transported to the front lines by taxi cabs from Paris. But after this ended up happening and the Germans were pretty much stopped, both sides started to try to outflank each other. So you end up getting this phase of the war they call it Race to the Sea. It's where each side was trying to outflank each other on the north, and they basically were racing all the way through France and Belgium, all the way up to the North Sea. As the war progressed, it started becoming more industrialized and then more deadly. And you started seeing some of these new weapons of war that really focused, or I want to say characterized, the conflict. At first, the biggest one everybody thinks of with World War I, trench warfare. The trenches were not originally there. They started somewhere. And again, what was happening is these armies that were fighting old world tactics, tactics that were still being used during the Napoleonic Wars and even the tactics like in the American Civil War. At the end of the American Civil War, you started seeing the development of trench warfare. And again, this is all because of the industrialization of modern weapons. When you have troops lining shoulder to shoulder, marching across fields, and now they're facing artillery guns that are firing from miles away, and not just cannons like you had at Gettysburg. You have big artillery pieces that can stay in battery and be reloaded and fired quickly, multiple rounds. You have rifles that are more accurate, longer distance, and they're bolt action, so they're firing faster rounds. And then you throw in things like machine guns. This is causing mass slaughter. So to escape from the slaughter, the soldiers would start digging in. Now, at first, they would dig small little foxholes, and they'd be one person at a spot. Well, if I wanted to go get a cigarette or share a drink with my buddy in the next foxhole, I had to either A, get out of my foxhole and go over, or I would start digging a tunnel between my foxhole to my buddies. And this started happening. This way I'm staying below ground and out of the way of getting shot by rifles and machine guns and potentially being protected from artillery. So this is what started developing the trenches. You start having these small little foxholes that dug into tunnels and then tunnels into bigger tunnels. And it just spread on and on. Now, something about the trenches too, the trenches were not straight lines. If you actually look at them, they are very much zigzagged. The reason for this is artillery shells. If an artillery shell fell into a trench and it erupted, it could potentially spread shrapnel down the length of the trench, killing everyone in it. So if you made them zigzagged a little, if a shell fell in one section, it'd only wipe out that one section, but the rest of the trenches would still be intact. As I said, there are new weapons that were starting to be developed and used in this war. More powerful and accurate rifles, machine guns. You did have things like the tank. You started getting these trenches that led to stagnant trench warfare. The lines were not moving much, so both sides were constantly looking for ways to break the deadlock and the stalemate. The tank was one of these developed weapons that they originally conceived as a land ship, something that you could put guys in and sail across the no man's land to the other side. Now, the term tank, and this is an interesting little anecdote, the British developed it, and when they transported them over to France, they were afraid German spies would see them. So they labeled these big containers as water tanks. And the term tank just stuck. Other weapons and new equipment that was used is airplanes, like what we're seeing here at the Dawn Patrol. New battleships, the dreadnoughts. Another weapon that became very prominent was poison gas. This was a way to break the deadlock of the trench warfare. I know it's hard to see on my slides and stuff, but I've got a couple pictures of machine guns. And again, the machine guns were new in this war. Now, they were used prior to World War I, and conflicts like the first machine gun actually made appearance in the American Civil War with the Gatling gun. It was used in the Spanish-American War. It was used in the Sino-Japanese War between Russia and the Japanese and what is today present-day Korea. But by the time of World War I, they were very well defined. These guns now shoot rifle cartridges, but they shoot them at rates of fire of anywhere between 300 and 500 rounds a minute. Now, another fun, that's a horrible word. Another use of weapons that they used because of trench warfare was hand grenades. Hand grenades, mortars, howitzers, these are all weapons to try to fire an explosive shell into the enemy trench. I've got here in this picture, it's really kind of hard to see, but there are three different kinds of guns that they had. They had what was called a field gun. Field guns fired on a more flat trajectory. These were great to shoot further distances, but it was more of a line-to-sight kind of weapon. The second is a howitzer. Howitzers will fire at a slight bit of a parabolic arc and can get more of an angle. These were very deadly, and these were usually the very large guns, like the big Berthas. But the big one was the mortars. The mortars fire at a very high angle parabolic arc. The idea was if you're in a trench and I could fire a mortar almost straight up and drop it down, then it's going to drop down into the enemy's trench. That way I'm hitting the guys that are actually hiding in the trench. One of the interesting weapons that was used at the time was a weapon called the Paris gun. It was developed by the Germans and used at the end of the war. This was a very large cannon that was on a railgun, and it was known to be able to fire shells about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and it could shoot a range roughly about 40 miles, wasn't it? That's basically the equivalent of shooting a cannon from downtown Dayton, Ohio, and hitting a target in downtown Cincinnati. Now, I did mention a little bit about gas, and I've got some photos here. Gas is an interesting one. The first use of gas was actually by the French. They used tear gas. They reckon that the tear gas was used in crowd dispersals, especially during riots, so that they developed hand grenades that dispersed tear gas. Now, prior to World War I breaking out, there was what was called the Hague Conventions. The Hague Conventions are basically the pre-notion of the modern-day Geneva Conventions. This was something that all the European nations got together and basically agreed upon what was considered gentlemanly rules of war. Part of the Hague Convention basically said that any kind of poisonous projectile was prohibited. On top of that, any sort of gases that would be asphyxiating, causing you to choke and have difficult breathing, should be outlawed. Well, the French argued tear gas is not a poisonous projectile and it's not an asphyxiating agent, so it should be okay to use. Well, as soon as they did that, the Germans started to use it. Now, the Germans developed a new type of shell they called T-shells. These are small artillery rounds that they would fill with liquid tear gas, and then they tried to use them in Poland against the Russians. The problem was the weather there caused the liquid to freeze, so a lot of the times these shells did not burst and disperse the gas like they had planned. By April of 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans used the first form of poisonous gas. They used chlorine. What they did is they bought big canisters of chlorine gas, much like a helium tank that you'd see at a florist, filling up a Mylar balloon. They put them in the fronts of the trenches with nozzles facing the enemy, waited for the winds to be right, and then they cracked open the valves and let all the gas come out of the canisters and form a big cloud and move over to the British and the French side. The way chlorine works is when you breathe it, it would mix with the natural moisture in your lungs and it would form hydrochloric acid. That hydrochloric acid then would start eating and dissolving your lung tissues, and you would literally start convulsing and choking, coughing up blood, coughing up chunks of your lungs. This is a horrible, horrible thing. The problem with chlorine, though, is it is very colorful, kind of a yellowish green, and it is very much of a common sense. I'm sure every one of you have probably smelled chlorine go into a public pool. You know the smell. So if you started getting a whiff of that smell in the air, you knew something was coming up. So they start developing gas masks. Again, the idea with these gases, especially chlorine, it's heavier than air, so it would sink in the low spots, such as the trenches. So the idea is if I flood the area with chlorine gas and it sinks in the trenches, the guys in the trenches would either have to stay in the trench and breathe this stuff and die, or they would come out of the trench where they're exposed to the artillery, the rifles, and the machine guns and die. Well, this developed gas masks. And then you start getting a bit of an evolution arms race with gas and gas mask. Every time there would be a gas mask developed to get around a gas, a new gas was developed to get around the gas mask. And this created a little bit of an ongoing effect. The second one was phosgene. Phosgene was actually the most lethal of all the gases used in World War I. When you breathed it, you did not know it. It was colorless, odorless. It would interfere the transfer of oxygen molecules to your bloodstream for your lungs, so you'd feel like you're choking, and most people said that it felt like a giant elephant was sitting on their chest. The problems with phosgene, though, is one, it's lighter than air, so it would float away and disperse easier. Two, the symptoms of exposure typically would not manifest until anywhere between 12, 24, or 48 hours after exposure. So this is not something good to be using during the heat of a battle that might only last minutes. This is also why phosgene was the most deadly of the gases, because guys would be exposed to it, not know it, never put on any gas mask for protection, and then 24 hours later, all the symptoms would show up, and they had really no way to remedy the symptoms. The third gas, which is probably the most famous of all of them, is mustard gas. Now, despite the name gas, mustard gas was never really in a gaseous form of matter. It was a oily liquid substance that would vaporize and kind of turn into a mist. And it would contact with your skin, forming painful blisters, chemical burns. And then if you all probably, if you experience a blister on the bottom of your foot hiking or something, you get that liquid pus inside it. Imagine that inside your lungs. Pretty nasty. Now, the other problem with mustard gas, because it is a liquid, it could contaminate the soil, it could contaminate the ground, it would contaminate and stick to your clothing. So it was really nasty stuff. There are still areas of France today that the French government will call red zones because they are so heavily contaminated with mustard gas that they won't let the general public go into. My buddy Rob there, he can contest to me. We went out back in 2018 in the Argonne Forest, and we actually found places in the ground where you could see contamination of mustard gas. So other weapons that were developed and used, flamethrowers. Now, fire has always been a weapon used in warfare as far back as man has been able to pick up a stone. But when you start developing pressurized gasoline projecting out and igniting it, now you're bringing in a whole new terror weapon. All of this led to new tactics involved in fighting the war. So you start getting things like trench raids. You start getting the Germans developing stormtroopers, which were small groups of men that would attack an area of the trench and try to break a hole in the trench for the rest of the German army to basically march through. The other thing you had was you still had large-scale attacks. A lot of the times, unlike modern day warfare where you have a group of soldiers like a platoon or a squad go out, you had more company size or battalion size, large groups of men leading attacks. And a lot of the times, as a precursor to a major offensive, they would fire a preparatory bombardment of artillery. This was also a major downfall because if you're the recipient of this and all of a sudden your lines are just getting pummeled by artillery fire, it typically wasn't a good indication that an attack was imminent at any moment or any day. Now, talking about the airplane, and especially since we're here at this event, the airplane is an interesting one. The Wright brothers first flew the first plane at Kitty Hawk in December of 1903. World War I broke out in 1914, only 11 years after the invention of the airplane. So this was an absolute brand new marvel. Now, the planes, they were very slow to be adapted at first. It took a while before they realized what kind of use they can do with them. The first planes would go up and they would more or less act as cavalry scouts. They would fly and take reconnaissance of where enemy positions are, enemy movements are, things like that. Well, the problem is, British plane would fly up to go look at where the Germans are. The German plane would fly up. Well, the two planes would meet each other in the air. What can they do? Scream harsh words at each other? Wave their fist? So pretty soon, one guy decides, oh, I'm going to go up and I'm going to carry a pistol with me. So when I run into the enemy, I'm going to shoot at him with a pistol. Well, pistols are short-range weapons. So next guy goes up, he carries a rifle. You're shooting at me with a pistol, I'm going to shoot back at you with a rifle and I can hit you from a further distance. Well, you got a rifle, I'm going to increase my odds. I'm going to go up with a machine gun. Then you start mounting the machine guns on the planes. Then you start getting into all kinds of engineering problems, like shooting the machine gun through the propeller of the plane without chopping the propeller off. The first time that was ever really done was by a Frenchman, and he actually developed a deflector, little metal plates that he put on the propeller blades so that when the machine gun bullets would fire and hit the propeller, it would ricochet the bullet away. Not really smart, not really idea. What if that ricocheted back to the pilot? It was a Dutchman working for the German army who came up with the idea of an interrupter gear. This was a little cam system so that every time the propeller moved in front of the muzzle of the machine gun, this cam system would block the triggering mechanism of the machine gun to prevent the gun from being able to fire while the propeller's in front of it. So it just gave a small little pause in the fire. That way the machine guns didn't shoot off the propellers. Now, moving a little further with planes, you start getting into bombers. The first bombers were really guys flying over with hand grenades, pulling the pin, dropping over on the enemy. Then you start getting bigger bombs that they started figuring out ways to attach and release from the wings and the fuselages of the planes. Surprisingly, and very unknown to most people, they actually developed rockets, much like a bottle rocket that they mounted on the wings of the planes to shoot at each other too. But most of the pilots that were flying in World War I was deemed as more of a gentlemanly, knightly manner. They had a bit of an unspoken code of chivalry towards each other. And they actually had a lot of degree of respect towards each other. One of my more famous, favorite little stories, anecdotes of the war, and this is a display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. An American pilot, flew up, was shot down behind enemy lines on July 14th, 1918. Crashed and was killed. The Germans were the first to get to his wreckage. They recognized the pilot. He was a person of well-renowned fame. More importantly, his family was of well-renowned fame. The Germans had absolute complete respect for him and his family, that they buried him with full military honors and erected a simple wooden cross to mark his grave. 2 weeks later, the Americans had pushed the Germans out of that area and came upon this grave and found it with all the military honors, the wreaths laid and everything. He was eventually redug up and reinterred, and the guy, I feel horrible because before the war was over, he was dug up and reinterred 4 times. But this, again, was a very famous person. The gentleman, the pilot, was a Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt, son of Teddy Roosevelt. I display at the museum is the original cross that the Germans erected. But when you started talking about these pilots, they kind of were the rock stars of the military at the time. So you got some real famous aces. And to become an ace in World War I, it required you being able to shoot down 5 enemy pilots. 2 of the more famous ones that I have pictures here. This is probably the most famous ace of World War I, Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. The gentleman over here is America's leading ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, from Columbus, Ohio. Now, I talked a little bit about tanks already, but there's some pictures of tanks. But moving on, this war really was a war of attrition. Most sides could not break the deadlock, and they were constantly looking for new inventions, new techniques, new strategies to try to break this war over. Now, a couple of the big battles that happened that I'm going to talk about. This is the Battle of Ypres. Now, Ypres is one of these ongoing continuous battles. The first Battle of Ypres happened in October of 1914. Then the second battle, which is probably the most famous, was April and May of 1915. That's when the first use of gas was done. The third Battle of Ypres happened in 1917 and is also referred to by another name, which I will get to. And then you had the fourth Battle of Ypres, and you notice a little trend here. They just continue to go on. Another battle, this happened in the Mesopotamian area. This is Gallipoli. Gallipoli is more or less the World War I version of the D-Day landings of Normandy, France. And June 6, 1944. It was a British and Australian and French and New Zealand planned action to land on the Gallipoli Dardanelles peninsulas of Turkey and attack and capture the Turkish capital of Constantinople. Turkey was a country that had entered the war on the side of the Germans, and the British realized that if they could knock out Turkey, then that would open up shipping lanes to the Black Sea where they could start rendering aid to the Russians who were fighting on the Allied side. So the Germans really helped support Turkey throughout the war. Now, in regards to Gallipoli, the big famous one is the Anzac Corps, the Australian, New Zealand soldiers. They landed on the beaches, fighting their ways up the hills, and really they never could get off the beaches. The Turks were well dug into trenches at the top of the hills and the mountains overlooking the beaches, and every time they tried to assault, the Turks would actually repel them left and right. And this battle continued on for months, and eventually the British decided to do an evacuation. Now, getting into some of the more famous battles, this is the Battle of Verdun. Verdun is probably one of the largest battles in recorded history. Started in February of 1916 and lasted all the way until about December of 1916, so almost a full year. Verdun also was the first battle in which you saw over 1 million casualties on the French and German sides. Talking about some other weapons and battles, this is the Battle of Jutland. Jutland was really the only major naval battle that happened. This happened in the North Sea. The big navy of the time was the British, while the Germans were wanting to rival them. So the Germans sailed out from Denmark and met with the British royalty, British Navy, engaged in a fight, and then they retreated. Now, the British claimed victory because the Germans retreated first. However, the Germans claimed victory because they destroyed more British ships than they lost. So for most historians, they pretty much will consider Jutland a draw. After this battle, the German Navy never really engaged in another ship-to-ship battle throughout the war. This is probably the other most famous battle on the Western Front besides Verdun. This is the Battle of the Somme. Now, while the Battle of Verdun was going on, the British were planning their own offensive, and they decided to help relieve some of the French. Originally, they were wanting the French to be involved, but the French were so tied up at Verdun, they went ahead without them. For almost a week leading up to the beginning of this battle, the British fired over 1 million rounds of artillery. They told all their soldiers that all this artillery would blow up all the German barbed wire, and they would just pummel these guys so bad that when it came time to go over the top, they'd be able to walk across no man's land at a leisurely pace. Unbeknownst to them, most of those artillery shells were pretty much duds, did not effectively destroy the barbed wire. In addition, the Germans had dug deep underground dugouts, and when the artillery started falling, they just hid in the dugouts. They waited it out. As soon as the artillery stopped and the British soldiers went over the top and started crossing, the Germans came out of their dugouts and set up their machine guns, and it was almost like a shooting gallery. In the first 2 hours of the Battle of the Somme, over 60,000 British soldiers were casualties, 20,000 killed. Today, over 100 years later, it is still considered the worst defeat of the British military. The Battle of the Somme continued on from July of 1916 all the way to November of 1916. The statistics I've read before, on the German side of the Battle of the Somme alone, the Germans lost more men than both the American Union and Confederate armies of the entirety of the American Civil War for 4 years. This was only in a matter of months, and this is the German side only. Moving on, another battle that they had was the Battle of Messines Ridge. This is up near that town of Ypres I was talking about earlier. What they did is they dug tunnels underneath the ground. And they would dig the tunnels underneath the German trenches, and then they would fill the ends of the tunnels with explosives. They built 21 of these mine shafts, each mine having over 1 million tons of explosives. On July, was it July or June 17th? June 7th, thank you. They detonated simultaneously all of the mines. 2 of them failed to erupt, but 19 of them continued to go. They said that the resulting explosions were the loudest recorded explosions in warfare at the time, up to the atomic bombs use in World War II. Windows as far away as Dublin, Ireland were reported to have been shaking from the explosions, and reports of the explosions being heard in London were made. The result was it really didn't affect much. The British went over, they did wipe out a lot of Germans, but the Germans were well prepared for them. This leads into that third battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele. Passchendaele is probably the pinnacle of what World War I became. The landscape was so torn up with all this artillery fire, all these explosions from the mines. The water table had been eroded. The rains started coming in the autumn of 1917, and it turned into nothing but mud. And a lot of these soldiers wading through the mud would literally drown in the mud. This became an absolute quagmire. This is the Battle of Cambrai. Cambrai was the first major successful use of tanks. Tanks were still novel, but this is the first time the British Army was able to use the tanks, and they actually punched a 3-mile hole into the German lines. The problem is, once they did that, they didn't know what to do, and they kind of stopped for tea like Brits do, and that gave enough time for the Germans to regather and get back together. Now, all this is leading up to this major conflict, but what about here in the United States? What did we do? At the beginning of the war, the United States was a neutral nation. We wanted to stay out of it. Most Americans have viewed this whole conflict as Europe's problem, Europe's war. Now, at the time, this is the early 20th century, a lot of Americans were still first or second generation immigrants into this country. You had immigrants that were from Germany, from Poland, from Italy, from Ireland. Now, a lot of these immigrants still had devotion to their homelands, and a lot of them still had family and relatives in their homelands. You started developing a lot of animosity, and again, this is why the United States made an official policy or official stand on it that we were going to stay neutral. This is Europe's problem. In addition, for them staying neutral like this, it allowed American businesses free trade. We were able to sell and trade to any country in the world. And there's this big war going on where both sides are looking for new weapons, new techniques. So a lot of industry here in the United States was developing. We were building these tanks and selling them to the British and the French. We were building medical supplies. We were building weapons, all this. And we were selling them to pretty much anyone that came over to us and had money in the hand. This leads into a major problem. As I said earlier, the British had the best navy in the world. The Germans got to a point that every time they would try to go over the Atlantic to come buy stuff from us, the British would basically shoot and sink their boats and set up a blockade of the continental Europe. So Germany was looking for a desperate way to get around it. They basically said, okay, if you're going to sink our ships like that, we're going to use another new weapon, the U-boat, a submarine. They started sinking British ships. Well, they also started deciding to deploy their own blockade of the British Isles. Any ship that was sailing towards Great Britain or France was deemed to be aiding their enemy. So they started sinking any other ship that was headed that way, including American ships, American merchant ships. This caused a lot of problems with the United States and our diplomatic relations with Germany. One of the more famous incidences was in 1915, a passenger liner of the British caught the Lusitania was sailing from New York back to England. Just off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat discovered it, and without any provocation, any warning, fired 2 torpedoes into it, sinking this ship. Now keep in mind, the Lusitania was very much the same kind of ship as the famous Titanic. Everybody knows about the disaster of the Titanic. Now imagine the same thing, but instead of hitting an iceberg, you're being sunk by a submarine shooting torpedoes. Aboard the Lusitania was 128 American citizens, men, women, and children. Now, the Germans quickly defended their stance and said they fired at the Lusitania because the Lusitania was carrying contraband. They were carrying weapons. That has been proven to have been factual. But still, it's unprovoked attack on civilians. This led the United States to a point where we were severing diplomatic relations and on the brink of war with Germany. Eventually, Germany decided that they were not going to sink any more ships without warning. Their U-boats would surface and give warnings so passengers and anyone that's non-combatant can get off the ship before they would sink the ship to destroy any kind of war materials. Well, the problem with that is the British start developing a new type of boat they called Q-boats. These look like merchant ships, but they would have hidden guns below deck. So when the U-boat would surface, they would hit a lever and a plate would jump up and a gun would appear and they would shoot the German U-boat. So the Germans started screaming foul that the British aren't playing fair. So they resorted back to this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare and start sinking ships without any kind of warning. Again, this led more into problems with the United States, especially when they were sinking American merchant ships. And this really led the United States on a course for war. In addition to that, the British intercepted a telegram that the Germans had sent to their ambassador in Mexico, a guy named Arthur Zimmerman. And this telegram basically was making a proposal saying that if Mexico would join the war on Germany's side and fight against the United States, when they won, Mexico would get to reclaim parts of southwest United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, and make that part of Mexico again. But when the British intercepted this message, they sent it to the United States and to Washington, and it became a major publicity nightmare for the Germans, and it riled up enough Americans between sinking our boats unprovoked and threatening war via a proxy of Mexico that the United States eventually declared war on Germany. The official declaration was April 6, 1917. Now, here's where our problem really begins with the United States. When we entered the war, the standing military was only about 200,000 men. That's the Army, Army National Guard, Marine Corps, all of that. 200,000 men for the entirety of the U.S. military. Well, let's go back to that Battle of Verdun I talked about. The French side alone lost over 1 million men in just a couple of months. That's more men lost than our entire military has. So we needed to build our military quick, fast, and in a hurry. So Congress passed a couple laws, which are still in effect today, called the Selective Service Acts. They changed the laws a little bit here and there, but it basically started a national draft. Today, every male citizen of the United States has to register for the draft at the age of 18, although we have not utilized the draft since the Vietnam War. But by doing this, this actually increased the military from that 200,000 to over 4.7 million men in a matter of months. To me, that's a great accomplishment of our nation and how quickly we came together. Now, it's hard to see here in this picture. This is a really good one. This is actually them picking the first draft numbers. And the gentleman here, that's Newton D. Baker. He was the former mayor of Cleveland, and he was eventually appointed by the Woodrow Wilson's administration to become the Secretary of War. Now, getting back, we grew that military from 200,000 to 4.7. Well, we've got other problems, logistical problems. How are we going to clothe them? How are we going to equip them? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to train them? How are we going to organize these men? So we started developing all this, and this is the birth of the modern U.S. military right here. Now, lead the new American Army was a gentleman, a veteran of the Spanish-American War who fought alongside Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. He actually went up San Juan Hill, where Teddy went up Kettle Hill. Everybody confuses the two, and everybody says Teddy went up San Juan. But this was General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He was appointed as the commanding officer of this new American Army. Now that we've got this army going, we have to train them, get them prepared. And this is all great and dandy, but this is going to take some time. Europe has been fighting this war now for 3.5 years, and they're sick of this war, and they're wanting us to come over and intervene and end the war quickly. Making matters worse, over in Europe, you start having another problem. The Russians had suffered serious defeat after defeat after defeat, that things were not going good for the Russians. The Bolsheviks started coming in, and they started promising peace and bread if the Russian citizens and the Russian soldiers would basically give up this war. A little bit, a gentleman named Vladimir Lenin, who was a Bolshevik, was in exile from Russia, and he was actually living in Germany. And the Germans knew that if they could smuggle him back into Russia, he could kind of start creating all this havoc and chaos in the Russian society behind the scenes, and hopefully it would knock Russia out of the war. And that's exactly what happened. Now, as soon as Russia ended the war, that freed up millions of combat veterans in the German army that had been fighting on the Eastern Front. Now Germany no longer has to worry about fighting a two-front war. They can focus on one side only. And they started sending all their troops over to the Western Front to fight the British and the French. And they were wanting to fight in the hopes of beating the French and the British before Americans were fully trained and shipped over to Europe to intervene. And this became Germany's race to win the war. But unfortunately, the Americans started arriving en masse, especially by spring of 1918. Of course, problem again. We get over there, we have to go through more and more training. We were sending so many troops over there so fast. A lot of these guys didn't get but maybe a few weeks of training, if at any, here stateside. So they had to really learn how to fight these new weapons, new tactics firsthand over there. Now, first shot that the United States fired in World War I on the Western Front occurred on October 23rd, 1917. This gives you an idea. We declared war April 6, 1917. First shot in combat, October. 6 months between the two. Now, this is a hard picture to see, but these are the first 3 American soldiers killed in action in World War I. Happened on the night of November 3rd and the 4th of 1917. The names are escaping me, I know. Thank you. Going back to talking about the German race to win the war, the Germans launched what they called the Ludendorff Offensive, or also called the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. This is their plan to defeat the British and the British and the French before American intervention. They launched 5 major offensives in the spring of 1918. Now, the first major battle for the U.S. was during the middle of the Kaiserschlacht, and that was at the little town of Cantigny by the 1st Division. Now, the 1st Division was assigned to a French army, again, under training, learning some new things. But this is where our first major battle was. It was almost exactly 20 years later, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, that World War II broke out. Now, the last thing about this, when the United States got terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Congress has to ratify all treaties. Well, at the time, Congress was strongly Republican controlled, and Wilson was a staunch liberal Democrat. So you, just like today, you have Trump and Kamala fighting, you had Wilson and Congress fighting. So what ended up happening, Congress did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We never signed the Treaty of Versailles. We had to find our own peace accord with Germany. We still had an official state of war with Germany going on. That did not conclude until what was considered the Knox-Porter Resolution of 1921. However, keep in mind, all hostilities, all fighting had ended on November 11th, 1918. Now, what was the overall cost of this? The war, it left lots of things in the world. It changed the world. We still are feeling the effects of the changes today. They called it the war to end all wars. I almost want to say it was really the war to begin all wars. You can argue very easily World War II was basically a continuation or a sequel to World War I. The Cold War, all the conflicts in the Middle East, all of this stemmed from how World War I ended. You had the rise of fascism. You had the powers like Adolf Hitler coming in. He basically looked at all the problems that Germany was suffering at the end of World War I, and he came out with a scapegoat, said that, you know, we never lost the war. We were stabbed in the back by our government. What's worse is most of our government are full of people that are Jewish. So it's the Jews' fault. That's how Hitler came into power, really. It just led into things. At the end, World War I is widely forgotten in a lot of ways, but yet still remembered in many others. There's a lot of things in history and in time that have been forgotten. Lots of little elements, you know, you hear terms like being in the trenches. You hear things like a trench coat or a trench watch. All these are stuff that came from World War I. Sneakers, that's a famous one I keep telling people all the time. If you look at my boots, they're hobnailed boots. They've got metal studs on the bottom. I can't sneak up on a guy very easily with these without making noise. So the first shoes that put rubber soles over, I could sneak up quietly, and that's why they called them sneakers. All this stuff is a lot of things. You got a lot of inventions that really progressed humanity and society. Unfortunately, it was built on the blood and sweat of a lot of people. Almost 60 million people worldwide died in this conflict. It's my belief, and I know I'm not the only person, it's my belief that it's important to remember this stuff and try our best to strive in the future to prevent conflicts like this from ever happening. Whenever you guys see me out at the encampment, I'm not here to glorify war or anything. I really am here to try to remember these people. Well, that's pretty much my presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the Dawn Patrol event. So.
Thank you.